the information that judges get to make decisions affect policy, and the policy affects all of us. So if their policy is, this is bad for the air that we breathe and climate change, we're going to outlaw all kinds of gas-powered vehicles in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is something that affects all of us, and it's all based on consensus, and it's all based on modeling. So concerned citizens need to understand that this is a problem.
Welcome back to Climate Debrief. I'm Angela Wheeler. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Sharon Camp, the Senior Education Advisor for the CO₂ Coalition, about her important article, Muddling the Judiciary's Understanding of Science. One thing that struck me in your piece is how you describe the How Science Works chapter as not only problematic in its content, but also overly long at 62 pages and ultimately confusing for the reader. Why does the sheer length and structure of this chapter make it even more concerning for busy federal judges who rely on the manual?
I would argue that it's not necessarily the length that's the problem. It's the fact that the language is not clear, it's disorganized, the definitions are not simplified, they change throughout the document. And half of the document is a discussion of one study that they use to justify all of their positions, which is really rather interesting. It's almost like, let's do a case study on this one scientific discovery, and it's not even relevant to the judges. It's just trying to justify their positions. And then the other problem that I have with it is full of incorrect information. Let me give you some specific examples. Quote, according to them, fact. Science can neither prove nor disprove hypotheses. And scientists evaluate hypotheses based on both supporting and refuting evidence. So that is an incorrect statement, because hypotheses cannot be proved, but they can be disproved very, very easily. But then they also say the hypotheses are judged according to the specific evidence relative to them, and scientists are expected to give up a previously accepted hypothesis if new evidence or interpretations warrant it, which sounds great, except with climate science, they're not listening to the new evidence or new interpretations because they're from deniers, and it's against the consensus, right? So you got a problem right there. And then, of course, all of the previous points that we made on their contradiction on prediction, where in one part they say that a hypothesis can predict, and another statement they say that a hypothesis cannot predict. So it's an incredibly confusing document. And that is the big problem I think the judges would have with this manual. Like, they don't care about the scientific experiment. That's not what they're looking for. And how are they supposed to decide what a hypothesis is if it can't be defined, or the definition keeps changing? And how are they supposed to judge the methodology when nowhere in this document does it say you need to be looking at methodology? It's all based on models and consensus.
And with the self-contradictions, for example, it seems to embrace the elements of the traditional scientific method in one section by talking about testable hypotheses. This is what you're saying, I believe, and the observations that could or cannot be made, yet it undermines those same principles elsewhere. How do these contradictions reveal a deeper issue with the chapter's overall approach?
So these are quotes from the document. Scientific consensus is formed based on a body of evidence, not a single study or investigation. So now we're justifying scientific consensus. And in the words of Michael Crichton, one of my favorite authors, he said, if it's consensus, it's not science. And if it's science, it's not consensus. And so the fact that they keep pushing consensus is a real, genuine issue here. Because again, the implication is that if you aren't part of the consensus, then you don't know what you're talking about. You're a denier. We don't need to listen to you. Which again is like all of the big discoveries in science have been by that one person who said, this doesn't sound right. Okay. Another quote, complicating matters, public relations campaigns have misled the public about the true state of scientific consensus regarding certain scientific issues. I don't think we need to look much further than understanding that the certain scientific issue they're talking about is climate change, right? So there was that whole section on climate change that was removed by Judge Rosenberg because it was so incredibly biased. And so now here they have in this document on how science works, again, pushing that consensus is what's important and that the public has been misled by people who don't agree with the consensus. So again, we're getting away from science and now we're moving into politics. The scientific consensus is generally reached over the course of multiple studies conducted by different groups pursuing different lines of inquiry. Again, a justification for consensus. But as I pointed out before, that it's the renegade who doesn't believe the consensus or has problems with it is the one that advances science forward. So there's too much in this document about consensus. So now we understand exactly what they're trying to do. They want the judges to make their decisions based on what they have been told is a scientific consensus, especially how it relates to climate change. Here are some quotes on modeling, which they also defend. Models can and must be tested against evidence, just like hypotheses, okay? But it's really problematic if your model is making predictions 20, 40, 50, 60 years into the future, right? I was reading or listening to a program on TV where a decision was made based on a model that came up with a prediction of melting Arctic ice by 2100. Okay? That's 74 years from now. How am I supposed to judge the accuracy of that model if the actual prediction doesn't come true? Do you see how absurd this is? And yet they defend their models. If a model's prediction doesn't match the key elements of our observations or evidence, we must reevaluate our input parameters and or the sufficiency and accuracy of the model. But you can't do that with the climate science models. They do it with weather modeling all the time because their goal is accuracy. But that's not the goal of the climate models. And then they also say that predictions from widely accepted models may be considered evidentiary and used to build other arguments. Okay? But please keep in mind that they already said that a model was based on a hypothesis. So how can it be considered evidentiary if it's based on a hypothesis? It can't, is the answer, because there's no evidence to support your hypothesis. Your hypothesis is a standalone, and that's what we're going to use to make our model. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but it just, so they have, the examples that they give are very specific on models that are able to predict. One is a reference guide on exposure science, and the other is the reference guide on the estimation of economic damages. Both of those are easily verifiable because the predictions come true within a short period of time, right? And they're using this to defend their climate models when their predictions aren't supposed to come true for 20, 30, 40 years. So examples of failed model predictions. These are my favorite, okay? Back in 2007, scientists in the U.S., we don't know who these scientists are because this was, part of the consensus and the stuff that was published in the media. Arctic summers are going to be ice-free by 2013 by Jonathan Amos, a science reporter, the BBC News in San Francisco, published on December the 12th, 2007. Well, it's been 13 years since then, and we still have polar ice caps on both sides. Florida will be underwater by 2020. Okay. Now, the sea is gently rising, and Florida, unfortunately, is gently sinking, which they don't take into consideration. But Florida is still with us and probably will be with us for a very, very, very long time. And so they've changed their prediction, and now they say the sea level rise over the next 30 years, again, unprovable, along the U.S. coastline is projected to be a foot on average. Okay. Now, polar bears, another one, are going to be extinct by 2000. That was, they were the poster child for climate change. They're endangered species. They've now been removed to threatened because their population has become stable or even growing in size. What's particularly interesting is that the population of polar bears was only 5,000 back in 1970, before the passage of the Marine Mammal Protection Act and also the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Both of those two prevented hunting polar bears and trading their parts, like their furs or their claws or whatever. Magically, within 10 years, their population rebounded to about 2,000. Currently, it's somewhere between 22,000 and 32,000. It's almost like it's kind of stabilizing. It doesn't look like it's growing, but it's not shrinking either. But climate change was supposed to make them all go extinct. And now, of course, they've changed their prediction. Now they say that they're going to go extinct by 2100, 76 years in the future. Then the last example I want to give you is the Maldives. The Maldives should have been underwater by now, according to people in the Maldives, according to assorted random scientists who did their model predictions and predicted that they should be underwater by now. But they're actually growing. A lot of the islands in the Maldives are actually growing without any kind of human interference. The main island, they are doing some, a certain amount of coastal rehabilitation. But a lot of the other ones, because these are made of living organisms in the ocean called coral, the coral has been growing with the increase in the sea level. So as the sea level rises, the coral rises above it as well because it's growing. It's an organism. So they haven't gone underwater, despite all of the doomsday sayers and so on and so forth. So all of these are model predictions that have completely and totally failed. And when they fail, they go back and they revise them and say, well, we didn't have our data quite right. Now we're going to push it 50 years out in the future. Like, it doesn't matter because it's not any more reliable now than it was back then. So the emphasis on modeling and consensus is really very unsettling because of the consequences that we can have with judicial decisions.
In your article, I really appreciated your clear distinction between what a true scientific prediction means and how the chapter redefines it. You give the great example of dropping objects in a vacuum, something that always behaves the same way. In contrast, the chapter seems comfortable with models based on unproven assumptions. Why is this redefinition of prediction so dangerous when judges are evaluating complex cases involving future impacts?
Well, if the models are based on unproven assumptions, but they can't be reliable, and they can't accurately predict anything, which is pretty much exactly what we're seeing right now. So the climate models are based primarily on the hypothesis that we mentioned this before. Carbon dioxide is the driver of changes in the climate, okay? And it's been shown, proved, to result in inaccurate model predictions and faulty assumptions, okay? CO2 does affect temperature, but its effects maximize out after it reaches a certain point, and that has been discussed in other podcasts here. So I'm not going to go back into that, other than to say that once you've reached a certain level of carbon dioxide, it's not going to provide any more contributions to the warming of the atmosphere. So that's a problem. But because these predictions drive policy decisions, many politics can be advanced in the name of preventing climate change. So here's a specific example. In 2023, the District Court, Judge Kathy Seeley in Montana ruled that the continued development of fossil fuels violates a clause in the state's constitution that guarantees its citizens the right to, quote, a clean and healthy environment, unquote. Okay, they weren't so much worried about the clean and healthy environment as they were concerned about rising temperatures in the state of Montana, okay? So it's one of those few states that actually guarantees some kind of a environmental safety or well-being in their constitution. And apparently they had recently passed a bill saying that passed a law that prohibits any state agencies from considering planet warming pollution when permitting fossil fuel projects. Okay, so this decision by the judge overturned that law. The law is specific only to the state of Montana. Okay, but these were some of the catastrophes that were accepted as fact by the judge because of consensus. 1, more heat waves and extreme summer heat were occurring. 2, there were more days above 90 degrees, had increased by 20 days between 1970 and 2015. And 2, they had increased drought and lower precipitation. So the scientists here at the CO₂ Coalition decided to dig into those claims carefully. And this is what they discovered. That in the days above 90 degrees, the date range between 1970 and 2015 had been specifically selected to demonstrate what they wanted to show it. But if you look at a wider range of dates, like say, 1890 to 2020, you find that there really is no discernible trend since the 1920s. And there's absolutely no discernible trend in precipitation since 1890, which means that since 1890, they're not having more droughts, and they're not having less precipitation, and they're not having more floods. They have good years and bad years. There's plenty of climate variability, but because the consensus says otherwise, the judge accepted that as fact. And so here's another statement that the judge decided on. She stated that Montana, quote, is a major emitter, little Montana, major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, okay, that affects the climate. So again, we looked into that as well. Just exactly what percentage of these climate warming CO₂ gases does Montana emit? They're actually only 0.6% of just the US. Okay, it's much smaller if you're looking at it worldwide. We got to go back to like thousandths of a percentage if you're going to look at it worldwide. And also, if Montana had decided, snapped their fingers, and were able to say, we're not emitting any more carbon dioxide from any sources at all, the actual temperature reduction would be 0.0004 degrees Fahrenheit of warning by 2050 and 0.001 degree by 2100. So their major emitter of greenhouse gases was a slight exaggeration. I shall be generous with the judge. Okay? So now this sets a precedent, because now that she's made a decision in favor of these children who said that Montana is ruining their future, now you've started entering green amendments in climate litigation. You're starting to, with the green amendments. So the green amendments, as we know, and our experience has been, it's just more regulations. More regulations to slow down industry, more regulations to make things more expensive. So now, if they have to involve, if the fossil fuel industry in Montana going forward has to involve some kind of a climate impact statement on their emissions, they're going to have a horribly hard time. Because one, you can't quantify it. And two, if you could, we've demonstrated that it's pretty much going to be immeasurable. So I don't know how they're going to deal with this. And if they come forward with too much mumbo jumbo to please the green people, then they're likely not to get permitted at all. So it really has severe consequences. So that's my problem with that particular chapter.
Another powerful point in your article is how the chapter suggests there's no need to fret about shortcomings in science once a hypothesis has gained widespread acceptance and consensus. You compare this to historical examples where consensus was later proven wrong. Which of those historical cases do you think best illustrates the risk of treating consensus as proof in today's courtrooms?
Well, I'm going to use a different example from the ones that I listed earlier, just to keep it interesting and mix things up. I'm going to use the miasma theory. So the miasma theory states that diseases are caused by bad air that's emanating from decomposing material. This was first postulated, again, in antiquity by Ptolemy. And in the late 19th century, they finally decided that maybe it ought to be revisited, okay? So it significantly influenced public health responses. Some of those actually were quite positive because in a lot of cases they cleaned up the sanitation. But the fact was that there really was no cause and effect. And so whereas they made the areas more sanitary in some respects, they really didn't stop the spread of disease. And so you look at like these pictures, and this is what kills me. Back in, you look at pictures of when the Spanish flu was spread back in the early 1900s, 1912, my dad was 6, so it was 1913, 1919. They did basically the same thing that we did with COVID, which is wear masks and go outside, almost as if they still thought, it was the bad air thing. But this consensus lasted until 1854, when it was first questioned by Dr. John Snow, who thought, okay, cholera, which is a horrible case of dysentery, among other things, he determined that cholera was not spread through the air because the miasma theory said diseases are spread through the air. He recognized that this particular disease was waterborne. And so that immediately disproved the consensus that diseases are spread by air. Okay? But it took them so long, 1,700 years, to debunk this consensus. And it was wrong. And again, one renegade came up with a disproval, which opened the door to the development of the germ theory, which essentially says that diseases are caused by germs, and germs are any kind of pathogen, viruses, bacteria, parasites, you name it. With that understanding, we have been able to better understand the causes and develop treatments for diseases. So if we'd stuck with a consensus, that wouldn't have happened. And so just because it's a consensus doesn't mean it's correct. So we go back and we look at the Montana case where statements were accepted as fact when there was no empirical data to support them whatsoever. And that's what consensus is. And that's why it's a problem.
With your impressive background, a bachelor's and master's degree in geology, a PhD in analytical chemistry from Georgia Tech, time at the EPA, and 2 decades teaching AP environmental science and chemistry, you bring such a rare and valuable blend of real-world experience and classroom expertise. From that perspective, how do you see this flawed chapter potentially affecting the next generation of scientists and citizens if judges continue to rely on it?
Of course, the big problem is it diminishes the importance of the scientific method. And then it attempts also to justify a specific narrative, to encourage judges to make similar decisions as that of Judge Seeley in Montana, where facts, as she determined them, were really just statements accepted on consensus, and that they can actually start swaying and directing judicial decisions based on what they believe is the consensus for what? Political gain, monetary gain, all of the above. And so if modeling and consensus are all that you need to win a scientific argument in a judicial case, then the argument becomes much easier. Whereas if she had said in her case, what is your evidence to show that more heat waves and that there have been more heat waves and extreme summer heat in the state of Nevada? And then they would probably come up with some kind of goofy hockey stick. But then she has to ask about, which came through as a model, by the way, a computer algorithm. And then she'd have to have questions about, tell me about your scientific method. And this is not being done. So that is the huge problem. And so I think that it's going to really affect the next generation of scientists because, one, those next generation are the ones that we have in school now that are not being taught the scientific method. And they're also the next generation of scientists that we have that aren't going to question the consensus, and that they're going to plan experiments based on what they believe is an already accepted fact when there is actually no evidence to support the already accepted fact. So this is a big problem. The scientific method needs to come back into the courtroom, and it needs to come back into the classroom.
In your conclusion, in your article, you make a strong and practical call for action. You urge Judge Robin Rosenberg to remove this How Science Works chapter, just as she removed the climate one. And you also call on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine to also act, since they host the manual. What specific improvements would you recommend for a revised chapter, and how can listeners or concerned citizens help encourage that positive change?
Well, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine helped support the writing of the chapter. So having them take it down is probably a dream. But I think I mentioned before that you really don't need to reinvent the wheel, because the chapter that they had on how science works was fine the way it was written. So what can the 2011 one before it was replaced? So concerned citizens probably should start talking to maybe their representatives in Congress, maybe their senators, talking about, why taking the scientific method out is a huge problem, and why the revision of this particular chapter has not made anything clear. It's just made things more complicated and supported the whole ideas of consensus and modeling. I don't think people understand that, but I think that we've demonstrated with Judge Seeley's decisions that the information that judges get to make decisions affect policy, and the policy affects all of us. So if their policy is, this is bad for the air that we breathe and climate change, we're going to outlaw all kinds of gas-powered vehicles, which I believe they did actually try to do in the government in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is something that affects all of us, and it's all based on consensus, and it's all based on modeling. So concerned citizens need to understand that this is a problem, and maybe they should write Judge Rosenberg. I mean, she's the one that has the ability to make the decision to leave it on or remove it, and they've got a perfect example of what to replace it with, which is put back the old one. It's like really easy. Just put back the old one. There was nothing wrong with it. So that's my conclusion. That's how concerned citizens can help.
As we wrap up this conversation, Dr. Camp, is there anything else from your article or your experience that you wish more judges, policymakers, or everyday Americans truly understood about how science actually works and why protecting that understanding in our courts matters so deeply?
Well, yeah, there's a lot that bothers me. I'm really concerned that the people in power are trying to control the scientific process by restraining it with models and consensus. That bothers me a lot. The other thing that bothers me is, again, the cancellation of scientists who have tried to say, that there's just something rotten in Denmark here. There's just nothing, none of this makes sense. Or how could you tell me the ocean is acidifying when it's a buffered solution and the pH barely changes? How can you tell me that the coral reefs are going to disappear when in 2024 they had the highest coverage of coral at any time since they have been measured since the 1980s? Why are you repressing this information from me? And the other thing is the dishonesty that's going on. Like, as early as 2008, scientists would be picked to give a report of their area of expertise to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for them to release in their annual report. And then they have two. They have the annual report, and then they have the report for policymakers. Again, here we go. And then they would find out that either their research would be completely misrepresented or left out altogether. As early as 2008. And then at that point, then we start seeing these scientists who are complaining being canceled. So now you've got what looks like ulterior motives to start controlling what the consensus is. We also had ClimateGate in 2009 that revealed a whole system of peer reviewers who actually were blacklisting scientists. They wouldn't review their articles. They wouldn't publish the articles. They would have certain ways that the scientific researchers, if they can't get published, then they lose their jobs or they get fired. In many cases, because they didn't follow the consensus, they get fired. And none of the above is how science is supposed to work, right? The way it's supposed to work is, again, by looking at empirical evidence critically and seeing whether or not your evidence supports your conclusions. But that appears now to be a direct threat to those who would push the climate models and the consensus. So we don't have any accurate way to determine whether or not what these models and these consensus are presenting to us have been developed the way that it's stated in the first How Science Works section, which is methods that yield testable predictions by which the theory could be falsified using the scientific method. That has been gone. So if we could reintroduce that, maybe we do still have some judges who can sit there and look at some of these things, some of these consensus facts that have been put in front of them, and actually question them. And, say, do you have anything other than a model prediction that says this is going to happen? Do you have any actual measurements for, something more than 30 years that shows temperature variations? Like, how was the temperature measured? Are you using thermometers at airports, or are you using thermometers out in the field somewhere? All of these questions are never asked. It's just accepted. Those are all big reasons that this last section on how science works concerns me. Like I said, there was nothing wrong with the first one. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Thank you for joining us on Climate Debrief. Executive producer is Angela Wheeler. Producers, Ethan Audie and Scott Wheeler. You can find more episodes of Climate Debrief at CO₂Coalition.org.